section here is talking about foreign policy troubles, and this is mostly going to be during the Carter administration. So, Gerald Ford, once he became president, he continued the policies of Richard Nixon, which was basically détente, trying to improve our relationship with the Soviet Union and be more flexible. And Ford, in 1974, he actually met with the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev, and once they met, they signed the Helsinki Accords. This was a document that said, we are in favor of human rights. Now, they weren't the only two countries who signed the Helsinki Accords, but it actually had a lot of nations in Europe that were in favor of human rights, just treating people the right way, respecting their basic, human rights. Basic rights that every human is entitled to. In addition, we're going to see the signing of SALT II. The U.S. and the Soviet Union are going to limit nuclear arms production, and this is going to be introduced to the Senate, and it's going to be hotly debated because a lot of people are going to think that, we're weakening ourselves. During Gerald Ford's presidency, though, one thing that is going to happen is that in Cambodia, which is neighbor to Vietnam, there's going to be a communist regime rise to power called the Khmer Rouge. And they're led by this dude named Pol Pot, who is a horrible human being, and they commit genocide. It's a terrible situation. In this picture, if you can see it on your slides at home, these are just skulls and bodies and bones that are piled up by this regime in Cambodia. And obviously, they're not practicing very good human rights there. But at one point, this Cambodian regime, they seized an American merchant ship called the Mayaguez. And at this point, Gerald Ford actually sent in U.S. Marines to get it back. But we're going to see that during his presidency as well, Vietnam falls to communism. This is when South Vietnam becomes one with North Vietnam, and they become a communist nation. And so Americans are not excited about that. We feel like, we're losing. As a result, there are tons of people who were living in South Vietnam who had helped the United States, and these people are going to flee for their lives. They're worried that they're going to be killed by this communist regime. So, over a 20-year period, more than 1 million men, women, and children got on these super rickety boats, and they fled Vietnam. Okay? And we call them boat people. I don't know if any of you guys are Survivor fans, but a few years ago, there was this little guy on Survivor. He was a Vietnamese man. His name was Ty, and he escaped on a boat. And he said, for weeks, he was on this boat just, like this. There wasn't room on the boat. It was unsafe. It was no food. It was just a bad situation. Okay? And this is the only thing that they could do to escape what was going on. They had to brave storms, pirates, starvation, to escape this communist regime that wanted to destroy them. Now, like I said, Gerald Ford, that SALT II treaty got started underneath him, but it's going to go to the Senate while Jimmy Carter is president, and it's heavily debated. But December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. They did that to try and put a communist regime, make sure it stayed in power. And so at this point, Jimmy Carter's like, listen, quit trying to expand communism, leave it alone. And so Carter withdrew the SALT II treaty from the Senate consideration. He said, we're not gonna reduce our armaments if you guys are gonna go and invade places. In addition, he imposed sanctions or penalties on the Soviet Union. I believe one of those penalties was we weren't going to sell them any grain, and we were going to boycott the 1980 Olympics in Moscow, which honestly, that probably benefited the Soviet Union because, let's be honest, we would have dominated totally, suspension of grain sales. But Jimmy Carter is going to change American foreign policy because he wants to, let's say, previous presidents have seen the developing world, which is like Latin America, Asia, African nations that are not as, technologically and industrial advanced as other parts of the world. And instead of treating them based on their stance on communism, he wanted to decide how to treat them based on their stance on human rights. How are you going to treat people? And this altered our relationships with several dictators, because the United States had supported awful people in the past for the simple reason that they were not communist. For example, in Nicaragua, the Somoza family, they had ruled Nicaragua with an iron fist since the 1930s, but they weren't particularly good people. But the United States supported them. Well, they did something extremely brutal, and Jimmy Carter said, listen, if you're not going to treat people the way that they should be treated, we're not going to support you. So the United States withdrew our support of the Somoza family, and they fell from power. Okay. Jimmy Carter did try to improve our relationship with Cuba. Remember, the whole Bay of Pigs, Cuban Missile Crisis thing. We hadn't had a good relationship with them. But it went bad in 1980. The reason why, Mariel boat lift. We decided, hey, we're going to let immigrants from Cuba come to the United States. And Fidel Castro was like, okay, cool, I don't care. But he said that any boat leaving from the Mariel boat lift coming to the United States, they also had to transport prisoners. Now, what most Americans didn't realize is probably less than 20% of the people on these boats coming to the U.S. had prisoners on them. And most of them were not rapists and murderers. They were political prisoners. But, Americans, they don't like the fact that Fidel Castro is endangering the lives of the people on these boats, sending criminals to the United States, so our relationship with them goes to crap. Then in 1977, Jimmy Carter, he relinquished control of the Panama Canal. We had built the Panama Canal. They had given us a strip of land that belonged to the United States, and in 1977, he gave it back to Panama. A lot of people didn't like this, but the Senate passed the treaty. They agreed to it narrowly, and so we gave Panama back to Panama. Then we have the issue of Israel and Egypt. Okay, Egypt, over here in Africa, Israel's right next door. They don't like each other. Okay, they don't get along. So they had been at war with each other, like 4 different wars in a 30-year span. And Jimmy Carter invited the leaders of both countries to Camp David in the United States. He's like, hey guys, let's hang out, sing Kumbaya, have some s'mores, have a good time. But in all seriousness, what they did there is they talked things out. And they came up with the Camp David Accords. And the Camp David Accords are probably the biggest success or the biggest achievement of Jimmy Carter's foreign policy, because Egypt formally recognizes the nation of Israel. They're the first Middle Eastern country to do that. People were not acknowledging Israel since it was a created nation in 1948. And Israel, in exchange for that, they say, listen, if you acknowledge us as a country, we will withdraw our troops from the Sinai Peninsula. And they've been in that area, for a long time since they've been fighting this war. So that was a big deal. That was a major success. And then we have Iran. This green guy up here. Things didn't go so well in Iran. Okay. First of all, in Iran, there's this guy named the Shah. He's the leader of Iran. And the thing about the Shah, the United States supported him. But the people of Iran necessarily didn't. They didn't necessarily support him. He lived in excess. He squandered people's money and used it on himself. If you guys saw that list of movies I posted, one of the movies that relates to the Iran situation, it's called Argo. Now let me warn you, that movie has a lot of cussing in it. They drop the F-bomb a lot, but if you can get past that, it's a pretty good movie. But anyhow, so we supported the Shah. Now here's the thing. The Shah fell from power. He wasn't super popular. He fell from power. And the guy who rose to power in his place was Ayatollah Khomeini. He had been exiled from Iran for 15 years. And he took power. And so the Shah, he's like, oh, dang, this guy's going to kill me. I got to get out of here. So he flees. And on top of that, the Shah has cancer. So the United States, you know, Jimmy Carter, he's a nice guy. He's into human rights. He says, listen, Shah, come to the United States. We'll let you get cancer treatment. Okay, so he comes to the United States. Well, the people of Iran, they lose their crap over this. Okay, so there's some Iranian radicals, a bunch of like college-age students, and they invade the United States Embassy, and they take 66 American hostages. Okay, 66 American hostages. And they held these hostages for over a year. The United States was not able to secure their release. It wasn't happening. And a lot of foreigners, they believed that Jimmy Carter was weak. And so they weren't really afraid of him. And then the day that Ronald Reagan took presidency, the hostages were released. So that was a big deal.